So good afternoon to everybody who has joined this webinar. My name is Nolene Blackwell. I am the Chief Executive of Dublin Rape Crisis Centre and really pleased to be bringing you this webinar, this day, which is within the 16 days of action worldwide against violence against women and gender-based violence. That 16 days of activism runs from the 25th of November to the 10th of December, and all around the world, people focus in on issues that affect predominantly women and girls, but people of all genders in the area of intimate violence, gender-based violence, violence which happens by virtue of a person's gender. It is relevant that we have this seminar on SAVI 20 years on. The Sexual Assault and Violence in Ireland survey, which had the great acronym of SAVI, was published in 2002. It had been commissioned by Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, and the research was carried out by a team of researchers from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, and we are very pleased to have the lead researcher in that, Professor Hannah McGee, to speak to us in a few moments to give the keynote address. It was the first nationwide survey done with a strict methodology and with an excellent research base to look at the issue of sexual prevalence in Ireland. It was groundbreaking in the way that it carried out the research, and the results were startling, that 42% of women and 28% of men surveyed and as a representative sample had been impacted by sexual violence. That was 20 years ago, and SAVI has never been repeated since then, even though it showed us in plain sight the level and the extent of sexual violence in Ireland. Of course, Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, then led by the wonderful Olive Byrne as the director, knew that sexual violence was extensive, as did others in the area, but the general population did not. That gave an evidence base from which good decisions could be made, good policies could be made, and good systems put in place to support those who were impacted by sexual violence. But SAVI, for all its brilliance, was not taken on board in the way that perhaps we could have. It was not repeated. There were calls regularly for its repetition. But now there is a new sexual violence, a prevalence study underway. And we're really pleased to have Hannah McGee of the Central Statistics Office tell us about that, which is also groundbreaking in its way. We will be talking a little bit about research that Dublin Rape Crisis Centre is now has undertaken recently and is continuing with as a complement to the kind of information we knew from SAVI. And then we will have a look at what the implications were of SAVI at the time, what the need for research is, and what we can do with it. We have to say that we have used the information in SAVI for over all of the years to try and explain how widespread, how harmful sexual violence was. But it came into a hidden society. And to this day, the whole question around, the whole discussion around sexual violence remains too hidden, too hard to talk about for those who experience it, and too distant from the general conversations in society, even though we are clear that the harm of sexual violence crosses all strands of society, takes part in all parts of our society, of our country, And we are also clear that it is an issue where women are disproportionately affected, both in terms of the amount of the numbers, but also in terms of the impact on them. As we have this seminar today, there are more revelations coming out again around abuse of children in education settings. SAVI knew that. It showed the level of child sexual abuse, and it remains one of those things that no child should ever have had to be subject to, should not be subject to now. We need information on the prevalence. We need the information then to be taken up and applied. And hopefully we will be touching on a number of those areas as this webinar progresses. And we hope to close the webinar in about at about 5 o'clock or 5:10. I know there's some people logging on who may have to go earlier or who will join a little bit later, but just to say that it is being recorded, and that that record will be available on via the DRCC website on our YouTube channel. So you're all very welcome here. There will be an opportunity to put questions into the chat function, or into the questions and answers function rather, and we would hope to be able to deal with some of those questions as they come up. Inevitably there will be more questions, or there's likely to be more questions than we can answer, so you might want to get your questions in sooner rather than later. But in order to spark the conversation, we are going to start with somebody without whom SAVI would just not have been the work of importance that it is, leading the team of researchers who carried out the subject. Professor Hannah McGee is the Deputy Vice Chancellor at the Royal College of Surgeons, RCSI, University of Medicine and Health Sciences. Where she is now, she has responsibility for RCSI's health-focused degree programs in Dublin, and as if that wasn't enough, also in Malaysia and the Middle East. Herself a health psychologist, Hannah has undertaken research on a wide range of individual and system-wide health and social challenges over the course of her career. She herself says that she is most proud as a researcher to have taken on the methodological challenges of researching something as hidden as the population experience of sexual violence in Ireland. And this is also so much the case of making available the ensuing insights to support those working in the area and the wider population who are affected by sexual violence. Hannah has been a good friend and has continued to give insights to us at Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. And I'm happy to invite Hannah now to switch on her video, and there she is. And Hannah, we look forward to hearing from you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nolene, and good evening to everybody watching live, and for those who will be watching a recording of this later on. I'm really very pleased to be here as well as part of the 16 days, and compliments to Dublin Rape Crisis Centre for their continued work on everyone's behalf. So I'm happy to speak about SAVI 20 years on. This is a copy of the report, which is out of print, but it's available online. It's a bit of a tome. It's about 300 pages, but it's because we spent quite a lot of time explaining our methodologies, our backgrounds, and looking at some particularly vulnerable groups, which we won't have time to speak about today. But I'm going to start by talking a bit about the wider context in which SAVI happened, a bit about the survey itself, some highlight findings, a little bit of the response between then and now, and just some reflections on our current status. And I'm looking forward to hearing about progress from Helen and from other speakers after me. But to start with, in terms of the wider context of SAVI at really effectively the turn of the century, In 1999, Dublin Rape Crisis Centre was funded by Atlantic Philanthropies and by philanthropist Chuck Feeney to undertake a pilot project, really asking the question, could you do a national survey of sexual violence in Ireland? Could you do it carefully in ways that were credible and also ways that were safe for participants? Really, I think it's worth making the point that this was quite visionary of Olive Braden at the time, of Ellen O'Malley Dunlop in the intervening time, and of Noeline Blackwell as leaders of Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. In many areas of life, we didn't have overall population surveys. So really at the time that this was done, we were ahead of most other countries in the world in terms of having a national population survey. But we ran the pilot, and again, there's a lot of planning in terms of how the work was done. We took international advice, and the pilot gave us a sense that we could safely proceed to run a national survey. And it was then jointly funded by the Department of Health and Department of Justice, Equality and Law Reform, as it was called, to run a national survey. And we trained 18 staff and myself. Staff worked half-time because this is very, very demanding work. And we collected data over most of 2001, and we completed 3,120 interviews. I'll come back to that in just a moment. And the study was launched then in 2002 by President Mary McAleese, who kindly gave the authority to the study, and who herself reminded us on the launch day that she had worked as a volunteer for Belfast Rape Crisis Centre during her student days. The other aspect to say in terms of context at the time, it's very hard to imagine what life was like 20 years ago. But the SAVI study predated all of the subsequent reports on clerical and institutional and schools-based abuse that have come out since then. In fact, in the months before SAVI was launched, the BBC documentary, as it was, Suing the Pope by Colin McGorman and others in Ferns came out. But the Ferns report that was triggered by that came out in 2005. And as you'll see, a long list of subsequent reports on clerical and institutional abuse. And as Noeline has alluded to, right up to last month, we're hearing about new institution-wide disclosures. So what SAVI really did was it gave a baseline, a population baseline, in which to understand all of these institution-based findings. And I think it's been very important in that regard, because it has prevented us from being comfortable in thinking that everything is okay in the community, and the difficulties are only in traditional settings or in institutional settings. So it provided that baseline for all of these reports. In terms of the methods of the survey, we collected the data in 2001, published in 2002. We had a team of 19 of us, and we interviewed, as I said, over 3,000 members of the public, with a 71% response rate, which is in these days extraordinary. People are more and more protective of their time, but we worked very hard to have a high response rate so that the results would be valid. The study was done by anonymous telephone survey, which, if for those who are not familiar, might sound like a strange thing to do, but it gives protection to the individual who's providing the information. We made sure that everybody we spoke to was an adult, and that they were in a home or confidential telephone situation where they weren't going to be overheard by anybody else. The telephone numbers, we genuinely didn't know who the names and addresses of any of the people. At the time, we all had large telephone books, but it's an ESRI methodology where you select one real phone number, and then taking the last two digits, you make 100 numbers from that. So we were able to say to people, we genuinely don't know who you are, what your name and address is, nor did we want to. There's a lengthy description in the book about the supports provided, including counselling, and again, we were able to anonymously point people in the direction with a password of contacting their local rape crisis centre around the country if they needed to speak to somebody as a priority after a telephone call like this. And we had a follow-up support check 2 or 3 days after the initial call with people. We talked about a wide range of issues, from attitudes to sexual violence, experiences ranging from non-contact abuse right to the most serious crimes. We asked about perpetrators. We asked about disclosure, about use of services, the impact subsequently on the person, and awareness of services for the broad range of people who said they hadn't had an experience. We asked them to reflect on what they would do if they were to have a sexually violent experience. So as I said, I'm going quite rapidly through this, and I'll give you a contact at the end in terms of where you can read the whole report. But if we look at the results of the study and we think about the prevalence, how common is sexual violence in society? And as Nolene's alluded to, this is like looking at the iceberg. We see the tip of the iceberg where people prevent to services or to justice and so on. But what's below the surface in terms of prevalence? And this is the kind of way in which we illustrated the data. We looked at men and women. And what you see up in the top right-hand corner here is we're looking at the prevalence of different kinds of abuse. So from the most serious abuse, which is in red, penetration, so oral, anal, or vaginal rape, right through to non-contact abuse for women and for men. And as Nolene has mentioned, there are much higher rates for women in various categories, but we also, and again, this was quite unique at the time, and credit to the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, we also obviously included men in the study. So what you see here is that, if I just summarise very briefly, about 28% of men and 42% of women said they had some experience of a sexually violent nature in their lifetime to date. So that's a very large number of people in society. For women, it's almost common. It's almost more than the majority. So 4 in 10 women and 3 in 10 men have had some negative experience with sexual violence. So we were all very shocked at the level, I guess, but for those working in the services, maybe not so surprised. I'm just going to show you briefly here. If we look first at men, for a particular reason here, the sexually violence experience of men as boys and as adults, as children and as adults. So what you see, firstly, the overall picture, maybe unsurprisingly, is that sexual violence is lower or lesser in adulthood for men than it is in childhood. So about 23% of boys under the age of 17 have a sexually violent experience, and about 13% of men. And again, you'll see about 3% of boys, 17 and under, experience penetration. So that's oral or anal rape for boys. And now if you look, and you'll see the difference in terms of just the overall patterns for women. What you see is the percentages are higher, but it's also evident that being an adult woman is not much safer than being a child. So the prevalence of sexual violence for girls is 32%. That's 1 in 3 girls in society women reporting as children they had a sexually violent experience. And then the numbers are 23% for adults. Now, if I go back just one to the men for a moment, I think sometimes when you see a lot of statistics, it's easy to get drowned with small numbers and so on. And I wanted to make this point at the time, and I still remember the example where there was a sense that that these numbers were very low. If you think about 3% of boys experiencing the most extreme form of sexual violence, which is a serious crime, 3% of boys. If you think about a Gaelic football or hurling match, where you have 2 teams of 15 and a couple of subs on the sideline, if you're at a football or a hurling match like that, about 1 of those young men has been orally or anally raped before they were 17 years of age. So that is pretty common if we think about right across every parish and every county in Ireland. On average, about one adult about 1 person in adulthood playing an adult football, hurling or football match has been raped before the age of 17. And it's 1% for adult men. When you look at women, then it's 2. And again, funny, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have talked about women's football or women's camogie matches quite so much, and I'm glad we have much more balance in terms of sports. But you're talking about 2 women, one on each team, So these things are very common. We're looking at this invisible but endemic crime in our society. And this is 20 years ago. If we think then about who the perpetrators are of these crimes, firstly, in terms of child abuse, the yellow is women and the red is men. So we can see that there are between 20 and 25% of children are abused by strangers. And reassuringly at the time, in terms of attitudes and knowledge, most of the population did understand that most abuses of children were not strangers. And so we have some differences, men more likely to be abused by strangers and friends and neighbors, and girls more likely to be abused as children by family members, as well as strangers and neighbors. Some patterns of difference that you might expect. Then if we think about adult abuse, adult sexual assault, we can see that strangers are much more common for men than women. So for men, strangers and friends are the largest categories of perpetrators, and for women, it's strangers and partners or ex-partners. So again, some of these things that maybe we now take for granted and understand better through data like this, but it was very useful in terms of thinking about perpetrators 20 years ago. One of the things we said 20 years ago, if I go back to the slide about child sexual abuse, is that if you were Sherlock Holmes and you wanted to find out who was the abuser of a child, you had about 80% chance of the child, if they were being able to tell you the identity of the person, because they weren't a stranger. One of the issues that's come up in relation to, I suppose, the publicity that's attached to sexual violence is that about 17% of all of the perpetrators for child abuse were authority figures, teachers, employers for adolescents, for example, and so on. And in terms of looking at the different kinds of authority figures, we were able to show that the percentage of abusers who were, get my figures right here, who were clergy, either religious ministers or clerical teachers, was about 3%. So about 3% of the abuses of children were clergy. And I think that's the very important aspect in relation to population studies. They highlight to you things that don't look, the things that look different in the media in terms of what's covered. So subsequent to SAVI, we saw a lot of coverage of clerical abuse, which has its own moral abhorrence, as well as legal and criminal and social abhorrence. But it's important to say that only 3% of those who said they were abused as children were abused by a member of the clergy. And I think, if I remember, Vincent Brown was the great campaigner who kept asking us, what about the other 97%? He continually asked it on his TV programs and in his journalistic writings, and he really wanted to remind us that we should not take comfort in thinking that sexual abuse is somewhere else and is done by somebody else. That it really is endemic in the population, and perpetrators come from all aspects of society and from all kinds of distances and so on from children, and indeed right up to the closest family relations. One of the other questions we asked, again in relation to just how hidden sexual violence was about disclosure. And what we showed here is that for the yellow for women, 42%, so 4 in 10 of the women who told us on the phone anonymously about a sexually abusive experience in childhood had never said it out loud to anybody else. And the statistics were even higher for the men. So 6 in 10 men who told us by phone in quite a lot of detail about a sexually abusive scenario had never said it out loud to another person. And that is one of the questions we have today. Are some of the higher rates of disclosure and use of services, are they because people are more comfortable disclosing now than they were 20 years ago? Or is it because the rates of abuse are higher, or is it some kind of unknown mix? But certainly at the time, many people had never even said it out loud to a single other person at the time. And we can also see from this slide that the disclosure of sexual violence was very low to professionals. So 6 to 8% of people had told the police, the Gardaí, even less for availing of medical services, and only about 1 in 10, 12%, had sought and used counselling services. So again, very hidden even to the authorities at the time 20 years ago. And we're unable to say how much different that is today, because again, we don't know what's below the surface in terms of the iceberg of hidden abuse. One of the things we looked at the time was the prevalence of sexual violence by age cohort. And what I mean by that, it's a bit complicated, but what I mean is the oldest people in the study at the time and the youngest people. Everybody was an adult. So we were able to talk to people who were born from 1911 onwards. The youngest person, who was 18, was born in 1983. And what you see here is the top 2 bars are looking at any kind of abuse, and the bottom 2 lines, the blue and the green, are the most serious forms of abuse. And this first slide is looking at abuse of children. So these are adults telling us about their experience in their childhood. So the oldest people on the left-hand side here in the diagram, this group reported less sexual violence as children, less child abuse than the younger generations in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And what we see here then at the youngest group in the study is the youngest adults in the study as a group told us that they had less abuse as children than previous generations. Now, there can be lots of explanations for that. We can speculate about whether some of the safety mechanisms, training in schools, highlighting of the issues made a difference. So this is about the abuse of children, the abuse as children. And then if you look at the next graph, these are the same people who are telling us what their experiences were of abuse as young adults from 18 up to 30. And what you see again is that the oldest group in the population are reporting the least young adult abuse, but these same people who were saying that they had less experience as a group of child sexual abuse are reporting that they had higher experiences than any other age group of young adult abuse. And that was, I guess, the credibility of that is that you get the same people reporting 2 very different patterns. I don't have time to talk about this, but it really begs the question of what are the patterns today in the population, and we don't have any insight into those. So just to think about 20 years on, firstly to say, one of the things that SAVI did was it showed people you could use this methodology safely, and you could get very, very useful and very valid information. So a whole range of studies on domestic violence, on crisis pregnancy, and on general sexual health were able to be done in the noughties using this methodology, which was a great achievement in itself. And our current and previous chief executives of the Rape Crisis Centre have worked extremely hard to try to get SAVI repeated at the 10th anniversary, and then 15 and 20. And I'm glad we're coming to some progress, as you'll hear later, but not for effort of many people to try to get this done. We were not able, unfortunately, to get the study done. One of the reasons why we need a new SAVI or a new study is we live in a completely different world. It's almost hard to remember how different 20 years ago was when this data was collected. We didn't have the internet. So all the issues of online content in relation to abuse, we didn't have mobile phones. We had very little attention to drug-related sexual violence, such as Rohypnol and so on. Trafficking was almost non-existent as an issue, as far as we all understood at the time. We now have increasing cultural mix. We have economic migrants, asylum seekers. So it's very difficult to understand what's happening there, both in terms of the history of people who come to this country and their support they need in terms of violence, and indeed their experiences here in Ireland. We also know more now about financial exploitation in relation to accommodation, access to services, and so on. And of course, just this last month, we've heard about continued exposés of institutional abuse. And I guess one I don't have on the list there, but I should mention, is that in terms of conflict and war, we see increasingly, and we understand increasingly, that sexual violence is used as a form of abuse for both men and women. And so the question then today is, what is the prevalence of sexual violence given all these different modalities that we weren't faced with? A couple of very quick points to end with. This is just an example from from Twitter, I think, from the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre itself, really pointing out that in the period from 2019, pre-COVID to the first half of this month, there's an 11% increase in reports of rape. And again, we would better understand that if we knew what the overall prevalence was. What we see here in Australia is a new headline saying that most women, 51% of women in their 20s, have already experienced sexual violence, and that cohort have experienced more sexual violence than women in their 40s or older women. So again, they're able to track over time because they have longitudinal data, and their longitudinal data is very worrying, that the youngest cohort in that study are experiencing much more sexual violence than their predecessors.
Hannah, Hannah, I'm going to have to ask you to maybe save some of your stuff for the panel session later and to finish up, if that's okay with you.
Perfect. I'll just leave that slide there for a second to say it was good news.
I want to say in answer to a question that's come in, the slides will be part of the recording that will be available afterwards as well. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
Not at all. I'm happy to finish there. My last slide was really just to say there's plenty of good news. And I work in higher education, so our own higher education institution, as does many others, have been working on consent. I have my little consent badge on today with DRCC, with DEFRIS, and with the HEA on initiatives in third level. And just my last sentence really to say is that, you know, third level accommodates about 70% of the young adult population. So it is only one of the areas, but it's a very important area to try to work on principles of consent and good behavior and disclosure and so on. So we're very pleased with some of those initiatives, but hand you back to the chair for happy to answer questions later.
Yeah, fantastic. We've said before in Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, and we'll say again, that we could have Hannah McGee just do a full day seminar just on it wouldn't even cover all of the insights that came out of SAVI that have been so important for our work and the work of others working in the field ever since. So it has been alluded to that SAVI was in its time brilliant, but that there was such a need for follow-up at another stage way before this, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, as Hannah said. The great news is that the Central Statistics Office have undertaken a survey, and I'm going to ask Helen McGrath from the Central Statistics Office, who's been involved in this since the outset, to tell us something about this new survey, which takes place in a whole different world where there aren't even any landlines anymore, Helen, I think. So, you know, nobody's a landline anymore. But Helen is a statistician in the Central Statistics Office, has worked on social topics for years, education, housing, persons with a disability. And so when the Department of Justice, who commissioned and signed a memorandum of understanding with the CSO on the development of a survey to capture the prevalence of sexual violence in Ireland in 2019, Helen was appointed to the project, and as I say, she has been with it since. So this is the survey now that Helen will talk about, so invite you to take over at this stage, and your slides have just come up. Thanks very much, Helen.
That's lovely. Thanks very much, Nolene, for that introduction. So yes, I'm working on the Sexual Violence Survey, which is a national survey to capture the prevalence of sexual violence in Ireland. And I could, no different than Hannah, I could spend a couple of hours talking to you about what we've done with the project, how we've developed it, how we designed it, how we found, engaging with the pandemic, and how delivery of the survey is going currently. But I'm going to focus maybe a little bit more on the start and on the impact of SAVI on, I suppose, our own design and the elements we took from it for the sexual violence survey. I'm just going to touch on some of the challenges in collecting sexual violence data, these would have been areas that Hannah would have seen when she was designing SAVI as well. So some things have changed, some things haven't. And then I'm just going to give you a brief update on the sexual violence survey on where we are to date with that. So I suppose, just as Hannah referred to, the tome that is SAVI, it's certainly a landmark report, nationally and internationally. So one of the first meetings I attended on this topic with policymakers, I was handed the tome. And I will say it was a well-worn, well-used SAVI report with plenty of notes and annotations and things underlined in it. So it certainly, that wasn't left on the shelf to gather dust. But so internationally, it has had such an impact, as Hannah's already talked about, and you've seen yourself from some of the slides and the data from it, but also internationally, trying to, I suppose, get a handle on this topic and changes in the area. We spoke to experts in the UK and across Europe, and the common refrain is Ireland, SAVI. It's such a great acronym. It always sticks, but it certainly has made an impact. And I've seen that when looking at academic reports, where they reference SAVI, reference some of the techniques used, the follow-up studies, and that, it really was ahead of its time. And no more so than looking at the definitions of the variables. So I suppose how the CSO got involved in this was due to the good work of a scoping group, which were looking at sexual violence data in 2018. And they looked at whether Ireland needed a prevalence survey on sexual violence, which it agreed that we did. And they pretty much used SAVI as kind of the baseline, the benchmark, and then augmented it for our times to try and, I suppose, expand and see what else needed to be added to fill out, I suppose, this changed world of sexual violence that we live in. So I suppose the fact that the definitions of the variables for SAVI were used again just shows how comprehensive their definitions were at the time and how usable they are again today. The topic itself, I don't need to tell you, is very sensitive. This is, incredibly personal, sensitive data that you're asking. And I suppose one of the first things I thought when I was given the brief was, how are we going to ask people these types of questions? And this report really does, answer people. You can ask people and they will tell you, those statistics that Hannah referenced there, about 60% of women and 42% of men having never told anyone before about their experiences. It's startling in and of itself, but it shows that it can be done. Put the right structure in place, you put the right protections in place, this can be done. And how to ask the questions, both in terms of your approach and the mode. So whether you ask them face-to-face or whether you use a telephone as was done in SAVI, or whether you use paper or online, which is an option we have now, that can have an impact on the prevalence, creating that environment so that people can feel safe and can trust that they can be open and honest with you about their experiences is so critically important. And not only that, the wording, how you ask these questions, and the kind of behaviorally specific questions that were used in SAVI, I've seen in reports ever since then. It's the standard. It's how you do it. You describe the behavior. You don't use terminology. Don't ask someone directly if they've been raped, because there's too much kind of connotations, judgment within that. So how you ask the questions is so critically important. And that was one of the things we really learned from SAVI, that first of all, it can be done, but you have to make sure you're asking the questions the right way and asking the right kind of questions as well. Strong research credentials, obviously, the DRCC and the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, like bringing together expert kind of on the experience, as well as people who are really strong in research. That's just a fantastic way of collaboration, and everyone gets the best out of the project. And as Hannah mentioned, the tome that is SAVI, the amount of detail she has in that in terms of methodology, the thinking and the research they did as to why they went the routes that they went. It's all detailed within it, so it's incredibly robust. And one of the nice things is that they're really willing to share experiences and share learnings from it as well. I do remember Hannah giving us time on her very busy schedule to go and talk to us about experiences running SAVI, and 8:30 in the morning, we were able to be squeezed in. But I personally, I was in awe when she was able to like detail like amazing little anecdotes from a survey project that had been, you know, almost 18 years ago at that stage. And, you know, it really was a very personal project and a very important project I could see for Hannah. And, you know, sharing those learnings and everything just means that the project can live on, and you know, we can learn from their learnings as well. One of the big things we saw on the from the project was their ethical approach. They really did put the respondent and the other staff members as well as the kind of center of this, to try and make sure that they were working in a safe environment and that respondents were safe as well. And I noted like that they didn't have names and numbers or names and addresses, nor did they need them for this, that this would be truly private, confidential information. And for the interviewers working together in a team, and we could see how, you know, they had put in supports for interviewers as well, because they're just as important. People at the door, people are not at the door, but on the phone, you know, collecting the information. It's very important to support everyone in the process. And I could really see that from the report. And that's something we took in the office and reflected on ourselves as to how we were going to deliver the survey. We'd really have to consider how this could impact our interviewers as well. We're really critical for this. And I suppose one of the things that we did in the office, quite a new departure for us, we actually set up a social statistics ethical advisory group. So this was actually quite new for the office. We wouldn't normally have a kind of ethical board that we would describe our methodology to, because we do have other governance boards from kind of our national statistics board as well as in Eurostat as well. So we set up this group, and Hannah, again, I suppose underlying how she can help wherever she can, actually attended one of our first meetings to really underline the kind of ethical issues around collecting data like this, to empower our group, to ensure that they would be kind of very alive to the issues that they would need to be kind of aware of when we were describing what we were going to do in terms of our methodology. So I suppose that just kind of give you some of the things that we took from the SAVI report, and kind of some of the learnings that we incorporated into it. And of course, that was 20 years ago, really. So, I mean, an awful lot has changed, and Hannah's alluded to some of this as well. Like, so, I mean, society, we might think we're far more progressive looking back at the turn of the last century to where we are now, but we've seen, you know, obviously kind of nationally and internationally, you know, I suppose the shock a society can see with, you know, scandals in Hollywood, the church scandals that Hannah's already alluded to. Even the rugby trial in Belfast in 2018, you know, there's still a lot of, I suppose, societal unease around this topic, and it's not easy to knock on the door and ask someone these types of questions, and that still hasn't changed. The topic is more complex as well. You know, we have a lot more, I suppose, as Hannah's already alluded to, you know, there's a lot more ways to be harassed and abused actually now than it was before. Even as we're here now in terms of a webinar, we certainly wouldn't have thought we would be like this 20 years ago. We would have thought we'd been at this 4 years ago. But, you know, the complexity of the topic, it has become more nuanced. And because of that, it can be quite hard to capture. Coercive control being an element of, I suppose, that sexual violence kind of spectrum. Very hard to define, only kind of recently defined in law as well. So it's not something the general public will be that aware of. And then how you'd craft questions to try and capture that behavior can become very difficult as well. Technological advances. So obviously we're all here, but it's I suppose it's empowered us. We've greater digital literacy across Ireland. We all seem to have devices to engage on the internet, but it's also given us in the office greater opportunities to collect data and greater opportunities to try and engage people as well. So we've been able to utilize that in terms of our survey design, where we're you know, predominantly going online first. So we're engaging people, asking them to go online to fill the survey themselves via self-completion using website or a mobile phone. So, I mean, that's given us advantages as well. The legal environment has changed as well from 20 years ago. We have GDPR, and obviously in our office, confidentiality is a core value of ours. But we're very understanding of, I suppose, the society's concerns over protection of data and confidentiality, and this is particularly sensitive information that we're collecting as well. Also, in terms of legal environment, we have our Statistics Act that we have in our office to go and sort of outline how we will maintain privacy and confidentiality of our data, but also we'd be mindful of, mandatory reporting and Children's First Act, and what were the implications of that for our situation as well. Interestingly, in the 20 years, there have been more surveys conducted across Europe. Certain countries have really kind of taken a lead on that, particularly Italy, in terms of developing violence against women surveys. So we've had a greater opportunity to learn from other countries to see what best practice looks for them and how we might be able to adapt that for the Irish situation as well. And then, of course, we've had the pandemic as well, which added just another layer of complexity on all of our surveys, not just this one. So there's been a lot of change in terms of the last 20 years, both in terms of our ability to collect the information, which has kind of expanded in terms of utilizing other modes, but also in terms of, I suppose, the topic itself and what it's meant. So I suppose really and truly the sexual violence survey has certainly built on the work of SAVI, using a lot of the variables that were in it and using I suppose some of the core elements of that, that sense of privacy and creating that environment that people could be open and honest. But what it'll mean is we won't be necessarily able to say that changes in prevalence levels happened over time. The results won't be directly comparable. But what does that mean? That means that maybe we'll have perhaps a more nuanced look at what's happening currently, that we'll have a new baseline to work from. And, as part of the office agreeing to do the sexual violence survey this time, we've also agreed to do a repeat in 10 years' time as well. So, we will be able to start talking about changes in prevalence levels. We will be able to talk about perhaps having a more, maybe this is a more truer reflection of what's going on with sexual violence in Ireland, and to begin that conversation, to be able to make those good decisions and good policies. And it's set in stone that it will be repeated as well. So I suppose, just as I was talking about sexual violence survey, I'll just give you just, I suppose, a very brief update on what it is and where we're going from. So it's come from the report of the Scoping Group on Sexual Violence Survey, which noted a comprehensive national survey on the prevalence of sexual violence with a substantial number of participants should be undertaken. And they were, fantastic piece of work done in 2018 to go and take a look at this, and they built a really detailed data list for anyone who was going to be taking on the mantle of this job, and giving kind of hints and tips on methodologies as well, very much taken from what was done in SAVI. So we've taken this, we've run with it, and we've created the sexual violence survey, capturing, as I mentioned before, the prevalence of sexual violence in Ireland. This will be a nationally representative survey, and the aim is that we will have clear information on what's happening across Ireland on this very kind of impactful area as well. So in terms of where we are to date, so we started this project in 2019, and we did an awful lot of work in 2019 and kind of early 2020 to develop a kind of variable list that could work for what we were hoping to do in terms of the survey, which, as I mentioned, would be self-completion. And so we did a lot of work there, kind of engaging with data experts, policy experts, to try and refine and shorten and make it more realistic and more reasonable for participants or for potential respondents. So we kind of defined our variable list. Then we've drafted our questionnaire, looking at our question testing, doing cognitive expert and focus group work, and developing testing for the questionnaire itself. And DRCC were very helpful with us, as well as other stakeholders in the area in terms of input on that. obviously with a pandemic, which slowed us down. We had to really stop, regroup and think how we could deliver this survey in a safe way, again, both for, you know, our respondents and our interviewers. So going back to the design board and seeing when we could go back out in the field again, which was a lot of uncertainty at the time. We were actually able to complete a pilot last year, conducted through April and June. And not only that, we did some focus group work on the questionnaire as well. So we got some really good learnings, incorporated that into the main survey, which we have currently in the field at the moment, but it's finishing up now this month. And our aim is to go for publication in March next year. So it's been a long journey in many respects, a lot longer for the stakeholder community who've been waiting 20 plus years, I know, but I think at least we're seeing light at the end of the tunnel, and certainly, you know,
Brilliant.
to be able to say this is fantastic. So I've my contact details there. If anyone wants a message or anything, you're more than welcome to, and I can take questions at the end. So thanks, Nolene.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Helen. It was fascinating, and I think that's new information as well. That's out there for all of us in terms of the dates as well. Or certainly, it's great to get it up to date, right? So Helen and before her, Hannah spoke about the policy implications, about the role of the Department of Justice in commissioning the current one. And in then being able to use the information from whatever comes out of the survey. And we're really pleased to be joined by Philip McCormack from the Department of Justice. So Philip is going to, you can unmute yourself and come on screen now, Philip, please, while I explain that your work within the Department of Justice at the moment is in the Research and Data Analytics Unit. He's worked in the area of sexual violence research, amongst other things, and he has a lot of other things on his plate as well. Since 2007, he was on that scoping group for the current survey that Helen spoke about, and he is on the steering group for the survey since its inception. In terms of his own expertise, it's research design, qualitative and quantitative analysis, working with academics and practitioners in the rollout of research and ensuring the robustness of the findings and their applicability to policy in a broad range of areas in justice. And Philip, I would be I'm going to hand over to you now, and I am going to probably prompt you when we come to 10 minutes.
You want to cut me short, Nolene? Not a problem. Not a problem.
Thanks very much.
And I actually haven't prepared any slides. I just didn't have time. We have so much on now. And let me apologize in advance. This is an old building. The doors are very heavy. A lot of people run around the building today. So you will hear the odd clatter and bang, but that's only a door being opened or closed. And nothing else is going on. Nobody has passed out based on what I've said. So I just want to say thanks, Nolene, for the invite, and thank you, Shirley. Great to see Helen. We obviously see quite a lot of Helen. CSO obviously will also sit on the steering group. Shirley, forgive me if I'm speaking too quickly. I might apologize. Yeah, we've done a lot of learning, I think, really over the last few years, really around this, not least around ethics, not least around respondent burden, which is really key, I think. And that was something that the CSO we helped us work through from the outset. Really, you can't keep somebody at the time, as was planned for pre-pandemic, in their own kitchen, in their own home, talking for over an hour about these issues. So the breadth of experience is obviously, that could be covered, is huge, whether it be lifetime experience of abuse, whether it be just childhood, whether it be just adulthood, whether it be just institutional, whether it be, it does come to a point where you have to decide to make priorities around, really what might be the gateways to the most important information that we can actually then use. I mean, Nolene referred to my interest in the applicability or feasibility of findings in policy, because this is essential to the work of research that we do, because our work can't exist in a vacuum. So that's really key. So I just want to get, again, we're covering some of the ground that was covered by both Hannah and Hannah. Again, I want to thank you for your involvement with CSO and ourselves on the SVS survey, not SAVI too. I think Paul or Helen has already kind of pointed that out. There will be some inference around comparabilities to that, but we'll simply be stating that SAVI found and that our survey found, and interpretations can be drawn over time. We don't know what they might be yet, but we'll have time to work that out. So since I will say that, yes, the department since 2010, there has been repeated calls for a second survey with a strong campaign from non-governmental organisations in both the domestic and sexual violence sectors, including the DRCC, National Women's Council, and Rape Crisis Network Ireland. And that's all been very useful and very helpful, and help get fuel for fire. And that helps the likes of myself in terms of research, because sometimes, again, you can be pushing for new knowledge in an area, new knowledge you know is needed, but it can be difficult to place or locate as priorities. So in late 2018, as was referred to, the government decided to establish a scoping group to consider the availability of data and make recommendations on a study to identify the prevalence of sexual abuse and violence in Ireland today and emerging trends. That's very important, because again, while we might not have in some instances direct comparisons, you can make reference to emerging trends and things that have changed over time, given changes in technology, changes in demographics, changes into institutional settings, etc. The scoping group was made up of experts with relevant department officials and was chaired by Professor Dorothy Watson, which many of you would know from the SRI. And also she would be an adjunct professor of sociology in Trinity College Dublin. In line with the terms of reference of the scoping group, the group produced a comprehensive set of data points. And forgive me if I'm getting anyway technical. I don't mean to, but it's the only language we have to discuss some of these things. Some of the data points for the survey, they consider relevant to the formulation of policy in the area. The group also considered survey methodology, ethical considerations, which that was a long conversation, very long conversation, and the feasibility of periodic data collection over time, particularly given that now we live in a world of data protection proofing, which we need to mind for too, and the minding of both respondents and those undertaking the research, which Helen, I think, has referred to as well. The group was submitted a report to the then Minister for Justice and Equality in April 2019 for consideration. The recommendations included, Helen referred to, a comprehensive national survey of the prevalence of sexual violence, and that the survey would be repeated every 10 years, or should be repeated every 10 years, certainly as a recommendation, and that remains. In the intervening period, a range of supplementary data collection exercises to determine the experience of sexual violence of vulnerable minority groups. So again, you can imagine in a national survey, you're not going to capture enough people within specific cohorts and their experiences. So we can talk about traveller community, we know about enough LGBT, that you can then make recommendations based on representation. So what will follow, and we'll be planning for this in January, starting in January, all going well, and that we will then be doing a kind of more qualitative exercise with, now I know that the work that Helen and CSO have been doing has been both qualitative and quantitative, with some open questions involved, as was the case with SAVI, that we will be doing a primarily qualitative piece with these cohorts to talk about their experiences, as was done, I think, in SAVI with travellers and those with disabilities, if I'm remembering correctly, and there may be more. So following then a further piece of technical work, including, and none of this work would have happened if not for SAVI. I think that's important to say. And the battle to get it done was way too long in the making. And that eventually bore fruit was fantastic. But I think we, as a department, we did all we could, I think, at the time about focusing on, as was earlier, we're looking at a Department of Justice and a Department of Health funding exercise, but also then involving other government departments, as would have been and is now deemed obviously appropriate, that we should also involve social protection, that we should involve education and higher education, and all of that is on the table now, and we would hope then to be able to deliver the report following the SVS work to each of those departments and convene some sort of joint effort to bring everybody along. As I think is a lot of the work around the current third national strategy, I think is involved in an awful lot of those interdepartmental groups, and also groups within the criminal justice system, like in Gardaí, the DPP, etc., etc. So the timeline for the survey, the SAVI report itself. Now I know through conversations, and this is part of the learning that I think we had, at the time, when we initiated the work with the scoping group, when we reviewed the well-thumbed copy of the report that we passed on to Helen, the report itself didn't give us a whole lot of details around project timelines. How long might it take you to do this piece of work? I think going through it, I think the assumption was made that really from pre-pilot to publication was probably about 22 months, something like that. But again, with so many differences to try to accommodate, we couldn't be sure that we were going to be able to hold to similar deadlines. Also, I think we had to do an awful lot of unpicking of stakeholder consultation, scoping, ethics, data protection proofing, which I've mentioned, questionnaire design and preparation, including piloting. So that's a lot. Again, apologies, Shelley. These are critical phases in the implementation of any robust research methodology and required considerable lead-in time in advance of a rollout of the survey itself. And again, when we work very closely with the Sexual Violence Survey and ongoing, although the work of the scoping group on the production of the report had stopped, we managed to hold on to some of the members of the scoping group to help assist us with rollout of these concepts into what would be a practical piece of work. And that would go. Nolene, are you coming in?
I am really, Philip. And
okay, no worries.
It's a pity, really, because we're getting some gems from you there.
Okay, no worries. Look, what I'll say is, can I just give my email address, and if anybody wants to drop me a line?
That'd be fantastic. Yeah.
So, you're grand. We're talking about my Philip McCormick is my name. My email address is pgmccormack, so that's mccormack@justice.ie. And really, we're wide open here at the department to be able to discuss anything with anybody who's, from a research perspective, is interested in the piece of work. And I know there are a lot of people out there who are, given the amount of contact we have with individuals over the years. So do feel free to drop me a line. If I can't help you, I can pass you on to either my policy colleagues, or we can bounce it off Helen and her colleagues, and we'll get back to you.
Thanks very much, Philip. Can you just repeat your email address? P is for Philip.
PG. PG, I never held you held me in such high regard, Nolene. PG McCormack, mccormack@justice.ie. So do feel free to drop me a line.
Thanks very much, Philip, and thank you for coming in on the conversation as well. It's very important that we hear that bit about applicability and the seriousness of justice in saying we will be looking at it for what is applicable and what we need to do. So that's very, very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Molly.
So in terms of our final presentation, we are going to ask Adam May and Sarah Monaghan to both come on screen to co-produce and to talk to us a little bit about the work, a different piece of research, but allied, that we have in Dublin Rape Crisis Centre have been doing over the past couple of years in particular. And we have been doing this in conjunction with Adam May, who's the managing director of Language Communications, which he set up in 1989. Adam specializes in research and evidence-based public communications and campaigning. In recent years, he contributed to a lot of successful initiatives, including two very impactful campaigns, the referendum to repeal the 8th Amendment in 2018 and the marriage equality referendum in 2015. And he has been working with us in DRCC, where our consent project is ably led by Sarah Monaghan, the consent project manager. And Sarah is with us for nearly a year at this stage, and previously has worked in public campaigning for the last decade or so, including on the Together for Yes campaign, the campaign to re-elect Michael D. Higgins, and as campaigns manager for the Wheel. Following Sarah and Adam's presentation, we're going to have just going to answer one or two questions that have come up in the Q&A, and then we're going to have a very short wrap up from our policy manager, Shirley Scott. So over to you, Sarah and Adam, please.
Thank you very much, Nolene, and hello everyone. I hope you're all very well this evening. So before SAVI, the prevalence of sexual violence in Ireland was unknown. And before we embarked on the consent project research, much of the public's opinion and understanding of consent was also unknown. We did not know how widely shared concerns relating to consent were in Ireland. We did not know whether people understood the complexities of consent. We did not know what the main barriers to people's understanding and engagement with consent was. And we did not know the extent to which the Irish public shared Dublin Rape Crisis Centre's framing of consent as a human rights and equality issue. So as a result of this gap in data, we could not yet at that time fully deliver on the SAVI recommendation to build comprehensive public awareness raising campaigns, which will be accessible and engaging for varied audience within that broader general public. And crucial to any such awareness raising campaign is the ability to assess its success over the long term. And as recommended in SAVI, this must be supported by a systemic programme of research to assess public attitudes and experiences and to critically evaluate changes over time. This allows both campaign and research to grow and adapt and progress in tandem in order to meet public need over time.
Campaign research helps us understand the scale of the challenge, public understanding of the issues, as well as the scale of public support for change, and any fears or apprehensions that people have about change. Because when we research consent, we're researching something that touches every one of us. As a result of the research that we've done to date, we now have a picture of the different ways people understand consent. And whilst different people have different understandings of exactly what consent is seen by most people as a core societal value. And the denial of consent to one is felt as an assault on us all. In our personal lives, most Irish people see consent as the first step and the foundation for all shared sexual experience. In preparation for campaign research at the beginning of last year, we developed a model of consent. And this was to provide us with a clear structure that we could use for both exploring the issues and also for analysing responses. So starting with want, being able to consent or agree to sexual activity with someone needs awareness or knowledge of your own sexual likes and dislikes. Talk and listen, it requires communication of those likes and dislikes, as well as listening to the wishes of the other person or persons. It means finding common ground and acting according to each other's wishes. And this tends to be the area that is most focused on when it comes to research campaigning. Lastly, it means ensuring that each person is free to change their mind about what they want or don't want at any point during a shared sexual experience or throughout the a long-term sexual relationship. So this is a model that we developed, as I say, for the research purposes. And it is, as with all of this project, it is subject to evolution as we learn, as we progress the project. Using this structure, we developed a method of modeling population alignment along with each element of this consent model using a quantitative survey. To help us understand the scale of the challenge, we recently completed a nationally representative survey to measure public alignment with statements related to the 4 elements. So just to show how this works, taking want, for example, or knowing one's own likes or dislikes, we produced a scale of statements that indicate more latent consent or more active consent. And here's here are the statements, 4 statements that are designed to reveal someone's relationship or attitude towards consent or experience of consent. So at the more latent side, you have, it never occurred to me to consider what I want or don't want when it comes to sex. At the more active end, I'm always open to knowing more about what I and my sexual partners like and don't like. So the way in which the survey worked was participants were introduced to the statements and then asked to select which best describes them. And what you can see here is how the population aligned with each of those statements. With this data and with the model, we can see where the population sees itself in relation to each of the 4 consent elements. With want, for example, 47%, the largest cohort selected the statement, I have a good sense of what I want and what I don't want, sexually and in relationships. Under communicate or talk, it has the largest percentage identifying with the 2 more latent consent statements. So we have 20% selecting it's just assumed that we'll have sex, there's no talking about it, and 21% selecting it's awkward to talk about, so we'll manage sexual advances through hints and body language. 14% feel represented by the statement, when one partner wants sex, the other should go along with it, whether they want to or not. And change has the largest, most active statement, with 54% saying, I feel able to change a sexual situation anytime either of us is not happy with how things are going. So by cross-referencing data from these 4 different elements, we found that the population is a very complex mix. We have in the analysis, we have virtually every available combination of these 4x4 expressions of consent. 1/3 of the sample selected all their statements from the 2 most active consent states. The 2 largest single groups were 7.4% of the population each. 1 group all selecting from this most active consent statement, and the second picking from all but 1 of the most consent statements. When we look at the other end of the scale, it's much smaller, only 2.6% of the samples selected combinations from these 2 more latent consent states, with 0.2% selecting just from this most latent expression of consent. The other 2/3 of the sample, which is, it really covers every possible combination. The largest single group out of this represents 1.5% of the total, and the smallest group represents 0.1%. So that was one form of measurement that we did to understand population alignment with those consent statements. To measure campaign progress over time, we've used sample polling questions to establish a benchmark. Some polling questions measure public alignment with the campaign values and definitions of consent, and some questions are based on real statements that have been that have come from focus group sessions. So this question set on prevalence of understanding, it represents a mix of both. And this is one example. It's taken from the poll that we did last year in 2021. It's alignment with the statement, I believe that everyone has the right to change their mind at any point during a sexual encounter, no matter how far it's gone. So it's a statement that is connected to that change element of consent. These are the results from 2022, and they are the same within margin of error as the 2021 polling, which leads us to believe that they will produce reliable tracking data over time. In establishing a system for benchmarking, there's also an opportunity for us to learn from previous polls. As Helen has said, what is the new sexual violence survey has learned from SAVI. This example of a question is from a set of benchmarking questions that are rooted in the Eurobarometer survey. So what we are looking at here is what people consider to be acceptable ways to understand willingness to participate between sexual partners. And body language, it polls like this, and what we've done is we've offered different responses, so different options to respondents to capture more complexity in their response. So in this case, what we've done is we've split acceptable into acceptable on its own and acceptable as long as there are other signals too. And this helps us see that many people understand that communication of consent, it requires multiple expressions, and that no single expression is enough on its own for the vast majority of people. So through this campaign research to date, we've found that individuals' experience and practice of consent is as varied as people's attitudes towards consent. This leads us to believe that understanding of consent, it may be largely gained through direct personal experience rather than learned through social means, such as the education system or public discourse. In every focus group, researchers have found a shared hunger to talk and hear about the complexities, the mistakes, and the successes that happen in our shared sexual experiences.
I'm just going to finish today by giving a very broad overview of the qualitative piece within our consent project research, which has only just wrapped within the last week, and so is very much still under analysis. But there are three main thematic areas that are currently jumping out there. Firstly, people desperately want a national conversation on sex, consent, and relationships. That legacy of silence and shame around these topics, as pushed by the Catholic Church, is still very much felt and mentioned often across all demographics, but in particular by those over 50. Nonetheless, all demographics aspire to more open, direct, and honest discussion. However, no one wants to be the first one to start talking. And, for most audiences, they are aware of the contradiction and the tension here. They want everyone to start talking and really see the value in that, but individually are very reluctant to do so. Secondly, we see that men are far less likely to speak about sex and relationship to their peers, and often to anyone at all. Women are more open in talking about sex amongst their peers and across all life stages. For them, talking about sex is a part of life. It's a part of dating, pregnancy, having children, menopause, changing bodies, changing libido as women age. People are also more likely to talk to their children, irrespective of their gender, about sex, relationships, and consent than their male partners. For the male participants who do have children, they exclusively view consent through this lens. They believe that consent is something for these younger people. It is not something for their own lives, their own relationships, and their own marriages. And thirdly, the no means no as a message is quite ingrained and understood across all demographics. However, the research would suggest that consent is still very much being viewed only in terms of violent sexual encounters and force. People in long-term relationships talk about the reasons for having sex as being complex, and that sex often happens as it's routine and is expected, or that it helps prevent marital breakdown, or that it combats the fear of a partner straying. For these participants, most likely in long-term established relationships, it is not uncommon to have sex when they are not in the mood, and this is not seen by them as non-consensual unless a firm no is given. They talk about believing that this is definitely not rape. Instead, participants talk about the importance of it being a safe and trusting relationship, and that within this there is a give and take when it comes to sex and to satisfying partners' sexual needs and wishes. So there's a huge amount in there, and there is a lot more analysis of this new qualitative data needed. And I suppose, as always, this research is imperative for capturing an honest snapshot of where people are rather than where we may want them to be. And finally, SAVI led the way with a particular focus on the inclusion and representation of marginalised communities. So in addition to the aforementioned research that Adam and I have just spoken about, the Consent Project will be embarking on a further series of focus groups with marginalised communities in the new year. So this will include sessions with the LGBT+ community, with the migrant community, with the Traveller and Roma community, and with those with disabilities. I suppose for the Consent Project, which is a large-scale public awareness campaign intended to reframe the culture around consent, it is a top priority. Cultural change has to be intersectional, and so we need to be always looking for who is not represented and changing that. To do that, we need to work with communities to ascertain the specific messaging, the materials, and the approach which will work best in tackling the barriers which are specific to that community. And without
Sarah,
research, we cannot do this. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks very much for that. And just that question of inclusion of marginalised groups as well. A couple of questions came in over the course of the seminar for Helen, asking whether marginalised groups, whether LGBT groups would be included along the way. I think, Helen, just would you be able to answer very, very briefly on whether they will be included in the research? But it will have to be very brief. Thank you.
Of course, and I will keep it quite. So I've written a response as well, but I will just underline it's a national prevalence survey. So minorities are and other cohorts are included within the general population, but our issue is we may not get enough responses from those various communities in order to publish detailed data. So we have included questions on ethnicity, we have included questions on sexual identity, sexual orientation and gender identity, but we'll have to see when we get there.
All right, okay, thank you very much for that indeed. Some really nice comments coming in about the importance of the SAVI research and the continuing research, and some good tips there from Elizabeth Kavanagh as well for our consenters, for Sarah and her team in DRCC. And with that, and in order to close this particular webinar, I'm going to hand over to Shirley Scott. And Shirley is our policy officer here, policy manager here in Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. She's a long-termer with Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, having started as a volunteer 20 years ago, and she's been a staff member where she worked since 2004 for over a decade on the helpline before taking up her current position. So Shirley, I will hand over to you to close. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Noeline. It is a really great honour for me to be bringing today's webinar to a close. I have a great memory of being in Dublin Castle at the launch of SAVI on Friday, April 19th, 2002. As a volunteer, a number of us were invited to attend. I recall sitting in the conference centre listening to you, Hannah, to Professor David Finkelhor, Professor Sylvia Walby and Gillian Menzies. And while I knew it was a big event for the organisation I was volunteering with, Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, I certainly didn't appreciate the impact SAVI would have for the work that has been done in this sector. SAVI left a mark. We have heard from all four speakers this evening. Hannah spoke about how Ireland was ahead of most of the countries in the world at the time in having a population survey, how SAVI predated all of the clerical and institutional abuse disclosures that occurred from 2005 onwards. And so SAVI set a population baseline for all of those institutional reports. But still, it is quite startling and stark to hear Hannah talk about the SAVI data, the numbers, the percentages in relation to prevalence, perpetrators, and in particular to disclosures. We heard from Helen about the influence of SAVI, how SAVI will and has influenced the forthcoming sexual violence survey. SAVI has enabled questions on such sensitive topic as sexual violence to be asked. The sexual violence survey, definitely built on the work of SAVI, and some of the core elements of SAVI have been incorporated into the sexual violence survey. The CSO set up an ethics advisory committee. It kept staff safety and the safety of respondents very much to the fore, like SAVI did. Helen has acknowledged that SAVI is grappling with some very different issues to SAVI, but most important to note is that the results from the sexual violence survey won't be directly comparable, but it will provide us with a new baseline. And more importantly, the sexual violence survey will be repeated in 10 years' time. Plus, Philip covered some of the same ground as Hannah and Helen, but I suppose it's important to note that there will be other qualitative pieces of work with cohorts that weren't captured in the sexual violence survey. And then we heard from both Sarah and Adam about the importance of knowing what society's understanding of consent is, why there's a need for research on consent. Adam spoke about that research model of consent. Sarah gave us those three main thematic issues that are coming out of the research, that they are areas that herself, Adam and her team will be working on. And she also touched on something that Philip touched on, and that is working with those marginalized, hard to reach groups. And that's something that the consent research will be doing in the coming year. So we'll give the last word to SAVI. The concluding paragraph of SAVI told us that the survey highlighted sexual violence as a profoundly disturbing and pervasive dimension of contemporary society. The challenge then was to plan and to act. As we look forward to 2023, to the CSO research, the sexual violence survey, to our own consent research, we need to ensure that all of their findings are implemented, that they are applied, and they result in further meaningful planning and action around preventing the harm of sexual violence. SAVI ended with an African proverb: the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. 20 years ago, we got a groundbreaking piece of research in SAVI, and what follows must be taken on board to protect the people of this land so that we can build a zero tolerance to gender-based violence in society today. And there we end the SAVI 20 Years On webinar. Thank you.